Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Stories from the trail, glacier, then and now, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Jeremy Covert. Thanks for being here today, Jeremy. I'm going to hand it off to you.
Thank you, Kendall, and thank everyone for joining me. It is my pleasure and my honor to always join you all at this dusty trailhead. So come with me, we're going to jump right into it today. I've got a tremendous amount of information to share with you all. Trails from the Dusty Trail, or Tales from the Dusty Trail, Volume 3 of the 3-part Glacier series. And today, Then and Now, is what we call the Joe Cosley, one of the park's first rangers, and the early park are what we're going to talk about and some of the things that led to that. And who is talking at you? Jeremy Covert, MFA, born in Louisville, Kentucky, home of the Kentucky Derby, most exciting 2 minutes in sports, and home of the world's largest baseball bat, 68,000 pounds. And that is where I'm from. That is my youngest niece on her first birthday. And Louisville, Kentucky, wonderful, progressive, artsy, fun community right on the river there. Great spot to be from. We just came back for a little while a year ago and somehow ended up staying and buying a house here, much to my chagrin, because I'd rather be out west. So my occupation is expedition leader, photographer, writer, speaker, and professional troublemaker. My favorite place these days is anywhere outdoors, any wilderness area. But I would always say my favorite place is Glacier National Park. And if you have not seen some of the other webinars I've done on Glacier, please check those out, especially the first webinar on Glacier, where it's kind of telling the whole story of Glacier geology, history, flora, fauna, introducing a lot of different parts of the park. It kind of is a big general synopsis of the park. But what I am doing these days is messing around with the website and podcast, which I have been working on for a few years. And you can check out some of that on my website, lifeonvacation.com. I have written stories from my book, photo essays and photos. Please do check it out. And you can access the podcast there, or you can access it on your iTunes, on your iPhone or Apple Podcasts or iTunes. And 9 out of 10 polar bears love it. So let's get down to business, my friends. Waterton Glacier International Peace Park is where we're going to be talking about today. And where is that? That is in the northwest section of Montana. I'm not going to go into Glacier, just giving a brief synopsis here. It's in the northwest section of Montana, right on the border of Glacier and Canada there. And it actually crosses the border, as you can see in this map. The top part of this map is Waterton. The bottom part is Glacier. It's much larger, but it is surrounded by wilderness area in all directions. It is still very wild. The Bob Marshall Wilderness is larger than both of them put together, and it's connected, and it is an ecotone, so there is 4 different ecosystems kind of blend together right there in Glacier, and it is an amazingly diverse and exciting place. Go there, you will not regret it. Here is where we go on our trip when we go to Glacier. The orange line is where us coming in, the green line is us coming back out. The reason I have this in here is if you look at the top portion near what is called the line in this neck of the woods, in this part of the world, it's simply called the line, and that is the line between the US and Canada. You see that line at the top of Glacier. If you go directly below that on the right side of Glacier, you'll see a place called the Belly River, and I've written on there Joe Cosley. This is actually what I give to the guests on the trips, and because I talk about Joe Cosley as we pass some of the places that are points of interest. So that's the area of the park that we're talking about. But Joe Cosley ranged from Great Falls and Missoula all the way up into southern Alberta and northern Alberta and British Columbia and all around, but the northeast section of Glacier and the southern part of Waterton, all of Waterton really, were Joe's stomping grounds. We'll talk more about that momentarily. Of course, Joe is part native, First Nations from Canada, but there is a rich and wonderful history, which I'm going to talk about just briefly, of the Native Americans and the people who lived in the park before all of these crazy mountain men and trappers that I'm about to talk about. And if you want to know about the heritage and history specifically, first off, I would say either go to the Blackfeet on the east side and talk to them. There's a couple museums. It's really wonderful. There's some amazing speakers over there. Ernie Heavy Runner being one of my favorites, Greg at the museum. They're really wonderful people, and they will answer any question that you have. And if you come on trips, we obviously answer any question you have. But we're not going to talk too much about it today. People Before the Park, that is a great book. It's on the left, and it is a primer for the history of the park and the original inhabitants. One of my favorite books, and this is on my short bookshelf that I have down in my living room that I constantly show people and recommend, is A Good Medicine Collection, Life in Harmony with Nature by Adolf Hungry-Wolf. And he, still alive, he and his wife, to my knowledge, have written like 50 books, and it highlights the life of the Blackfeet, the Cree, the Blood, some of that entire massive nation of Indians, and how they lived from antiquity to present day. And he is actually now married and has children with a tribal member. And it is an absolutely amazing book. And it's not just their folk stories and just their history. It's his experience of going there and living with them. And it's absolutely amazing to hear kind of a person from our time living in the ways of that olden time. And so I recommend that book for you if you have interest in that. And the one thing that I am going to say on this, and it's because it just kind of starts to set the stage, which I'm going to do at the beginning of this webinar, setting the stage for what created Joe Cosley and that early park and what people were seeking out and what they found there. And what they found there looked a lot like what you have in these pictures, except for no sign and no triple bridge at this the triple arches here on the Going to the Sun Road. And actually Logan Pass was named after Charlie Logan, one of the park's first superintendents, supposedly a really great guy for the people of the park and the area. But this was not the original name. They had a couple names, as are with all land-based and heavily land-based cultures. They changed the name throughout their history as things happened in that area. And so one of the oldest names for this place by the Kootenai, keep in mind the Kootenai have one of the top 10 oldest languages known on the planet. This is an ancient culture. They called Logan Pass the place where people came from. And it was lost to them whether that meant, and different natives that I've talked to in the Kootenai have different theories about it, but basically either they had come over that pass, or one day they were down in their village and people came and they asked them where they came from and they pointed at the pass. And so it became known as the place where people came from because it is a really easy way to cross into and out of this part of the mountains. But also a place that what they named it was the place where the packs are lifted up. And this is my favorite name for it because imagine every man, woman, and child and person in your family, but not just your family. Imagine your family all lives on the same street. And then imagine your entire street and neighborhood, if you live in a neighborhood or can even imagine it. Everyone in your community gets up twice a year and walks 70 to 120 miles. And oh yes, you have to cross this massive mountain pass that we would later call Logan Pass, but what they called was packs, the place where packs are lifted up, because they had these braided animal skin ropes. They would actually tie and bundle their all of the gear that they would need to travel with in these packs, and then they would lift them up the cliffs, and then every man, woman, and child and person in the tribe would climb those cliffs to cross Logan Pass to go from summer to winter range and back every year. What do you think they thought about that experience? Do you think they looked forward to it? Do you think they were like, oh, it's almost past time again? Well, I'll tell you, they loved it. It was their favorite thing they did all year long, literally. And that's said for two different reasons. What I've heard natives say is, one, they were trying to get the children, yeah, it's almost fun time to go hike up and over the pass to get them excited about it. But also, they had these massive bison skin sleds that they would hike up to the pass and sled a majority of the way down the other side. How amazing is that? And every person in the tribe did it, and they all loved it, and they all laughed like they were children again, they said. And it was their favorite thing they looked forward to all year long, specifically the sledding part. I think that's amazing. So I wanted to share it. It's just some of what the original inhabitants were doing and how they were using and traversing the park in the exact same places that we visit at the Logan Pass and Hidden Lake Overlook right there. But that's not what we're here to talk about, my friends. We are here to talk about the Belly River's famous Joe Cosley. And another book recommendation here comes from Brian McClung's book, although I have read every single word that I could possibly find and purchase from the bookstores in Glacier area on Joe Cosley, and then spent countless hours online researching it. This is the one book you want to get if you want to get a book that's interesting about it. It's got a lot of the pictures from the slideshow in it, and it gives a kind of a chronology of his life And it's one of the ones that will say this is kind of a fanciful story of Joe. We think this is actually what happened because they're corroborating, reports for it. And so, great book. I recommend it. And so, who was Joe Cosley? Well, he was born May 24th, 1870, Joseph Clarence Cosley, Ontario, Canada, from a French fur trapper man and a Algonquin Indian woman in eastern portion of Canada. And he made his way in his late teens out west. By the time he had gotten out west, he was literate. He spoke multiple languages, which his parents both taught him, and he learned in school. He was also a gifted artist and draftsman and painter, which you will see some examples of his work in his wood carving. And he was also a gifted poet, kind of philosopher, and speaker. And so a real anomaly in the area of where he was and the people that he was hanging out with, because he was largely surrounded by trappers, hunters, professional hunters, explorers, miners, military people, and people who just didn't want to be found by normal society, which Joe kind of classified into that group also. And so he found himself out there at this point, already claiming, and it's unsubstantiated, although we do have our theories, that he had been in the Wild Bill's West show as a fancy rider and a flashy shooter. So that means he's the type of guy that would pull his gun out and be like, bam, 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 and like shoot cans off of his fence, 30, 40 yards away. Or he would be able to ride his horse fast, which one of his horses faster. He was a renowned horse racer in the 1880s with that horse and was semi-famous for it. He's also the type of fancy rider that would do tricks on it and do things like that. I imagine jumping down on one side, touching the ground, jumping down on the other side. So he was already had notoriety at a young age and supposedly was from this Wild Bill era. But as a lot of stories from this time with all of these mountain men, we don't really know, and we can only say what we can prove. Although some people theorize that that was certainly possible because he did have these skills. But to set the stage with Joe Cosley, this amazing guy, which we're going to talk a little bit more about his personality, let's talk about what was happening in the rest of the United States at this time. So 1870, Joe was born. This is before Yellowstone existed. You have a person like James J. Hill, the guy on the top left here, who would later be overtaken by his son Louis Hill in Burlington Northern Railroad Company, which of course becomes the Burlington Northern Santa Fe, which we are still dealing with that company today. Warren Buffett bought it. There is a reason. It's one of the most profitable railroad lines in the history of the world, if you can imagine that, the world. Completely bought and paid for privately by James J. Hill. And just a genius businessman. And, keep in mind, these railroad magistrates at this time were some of the wealthiest people in the history of the world, rivaling like Egyptian pharaohs with their wealth and lavishness. And you'll see examples of this here momentarily. And so James J. Hill was that type of person. This is Louis, the son, in the far left, showing awesome fashion of the time. I think this is in the 30s and 40s. And this is James's house and the James J. Hill house. And he designed it himself. He designed a lot of the park structures in Glacier, and if you have been to Glacier, you will see some similarities between his designs because it's what he liked, it's what made sense to him, and what he thought would be like opulent hotel extravagance for people coming from back east. And that was his goal. Not only was he trying to make the cheapest, easiest way to get from the East Coast to the West Coast on trail, because it was not the first transcontinental railroad at this point. There were others, but he was a very brash man. What he said about getting the railroad there, he said, give me Swedes, snuff, and whiskey, and I'll build a railroad through hell. And so that's the type of guy we're talking about here. And he was the guy out in front too, as being a scout, like leading this railroad charge, like deciding where to go. And what he said with his official statement from his company was, what we want, his quote is saying, is the best possible line, the shortest distance, the lowest grades, the least curvature we can build. And we do not care enough about the Rocky Mountain scenery to spend a large sum of money developing it. And that meant he didn't want to build a bunch of bridges, knock down mountains, blow up mountains, do anything. He wanted the simplest, lowest, straightest line through the mountains. And that happened to be Mariah's Pass, discovered by John F. Stevens in 1890 at the northern section of the John F. Stevens Canyon, right on the southeast section of what becomes Glacier. This is crucial in the formation of the park and crucial in some of the parks out west. the railroad people did not just want to get freight, they also wanted people to start going to visit these places, which they had seen for themselves. So the See It Here First campaign came from James J. Hill himself, and it was to get people out west. And Joe was one of those people who found himself out west in the late 1880s, and a few years later would be working for this man, Lieutenant Ahern, a much younger picture. And what they were doing, Joe was a scout. This is the first recorded, other than trees that Joe had carved himself his name on. This is the first recorded thing that Joe did in the area in 1893, which is being a scout for the 25th and Cavalry or Regiment, whatever it was, to discover and, well, not discover, but put an official road or route for packers and others through Ahern Pass here, which is absolutely treacherous. The mountains in this area are treacherous. And this is looking down from the top of that picture. If you were to look down, it's like on a knife edge ridge line. And so this is some pretty crazy terrain, this Ahern Pass. And so Joe gains notoriety as being one of the scouts for this. He is in the area, and he has been trapping, he has been guiding, he has been a professional hunter. He's working for the National Forest at this point, logging operations and gaining notoriety. But this is the first thing that we officially have as far as him. Now, at this point, now the railroad is already coming through, John F. Stevens, but there's also some other development in that area, the town of Alton, and there's some other train stuff happening, which ultimately goes bust, thank goodness, because all of that stuff is in the park now. And you better believe they would have dynamited a mine through that mountain if they needed to, a tunnel through that mountain if they could make money by running a train through there. Thank goodness they couldn't find a way, and Ahern Pass was far too primitive, and it is far too dangerous to use. Do not attempt to cross Ahern Pass. There is a warning in all books that talk about it, but Joe was critical in the discovery of that route. And this is a young Joe Cosley. As you can see here, he's wearing a colorful sash. He was always dressed to the nines. He would often paint embellishments on his hat. You see the flower there painted. Sorry for the horrible picture. A lot of these are very, very tiny pictures, very old. And so you see evidence of his art, and you see kind of evidence of his kind of persona, his larger than life. And, you know, he lived at a time, some of his artwork here, he lived at a time when, and in an area where it was very dangerous to say that you were Native American, and so he wore different hats. He claimed to be parts of different tribes when it suited him. If he wanted to not be left alone, or if he wanted to be left alone, he would say he was from a warrior tribe. If he wanted to be accepted, he actually claimed Spanish lineage at certain points. He would grow a mustache out to try to distinguish himself, you know, professionally and personally. So that he, but later in life, in his midlife, he assumed his role as his, you know, half Native and half French fur trapper's son. And he was a character. He was known as a ladies' man in the area, and it was joked that he had written on several trees in the Belly River area that Joe loves Lizzie. And then when Lizzie broke his heart, he scratched Lizzie out and then wrote Helen. And then when he broke Helen's heart, he scratched that out and then wrote Sue. And he was known from basically Waterton all the way down to Whitefish as a heartbreaker and a ladies' man. And he was a bit of a celebrity even in his younger years. It was said that, and this is a, you know, a lot of fantastical things are said at this time, but this is one that is accepted as fact, that he left Polbridge one evening after work, hiked all the way to Waterton National Park in Waterton, the town, and attended a dance there that night, lingered after the dance, trying to meet women and hang out with friends. And then he hiked all the way back all night, a 60+ mile round trip, which typically people would do in 5 or more days. He did it in one night and was back at work the next day. This is just some of the lore around him. You know, he was said, you know, once you got him on snowshoes, he was the fastest man on the planet with his big long legs. Even when it was not snowy, he did not hike on trails. He literally ran the trails because he had grown up from a young age trapping, and a trapper will have a long line of traps and they are just running from trap to trap. And so he could cover a lot more distance and make a lot more money. And he came out, you know, when he was a young man, he was trained as a trapper, as a blacksmith that repairs trap, but he had heard about the high prices the fur from the headwaters of the upper headwaters of the Hudson Bay would get, and that would be right at the base of the Rockies. And he found that out there, and so that's what he did his entire life. was trapping in this area and in the winter and then doing other things. So when he would come into town, these things would be printed in the newspaper and he would give little talks. So Joe Cosley's in town, arrived in town Monday, and he relates some harrowing experiences while crossing the main range. No doubt, Joe was telling them this, he was also saying this so that he could tell his friends to be there so he could ask somebody to stay with them. And that was, how he lived that kind of life. It reminds me of some guys that I know, actually. And so here is a little writing that Cosley had done. This is a little write-up. I thought about this for years. Joe Cosley, our park guard at Philly, was in town Monday. Joe entertained a crowd of listeners by relating to them a thrilling story of how he recently saved the life of a hummingbird, and then finished by saying, it's the little things that count in this world. So think about this. This tough mountain man, he has killed everything that walks, literally, for profession, and he traps everything. Of course, I am not supporting this. This is not, my thing, not why I like Joe Cosley. He is, what I say is, he is the last page in a chapter of humanity in North America that closed, and that where, someone living off the land and someone, living in that way, and literally living outdoors most of their life. I mean, he built 6 cabins over his life and lived in, but these were very small cabins. He mainly camped and ran around outside hunting, fishing, going on adventures, for money and hunting and trapping. And so you would expect him to tell a thrilling story of a bear or something, but no, he tells the story of saving a hummingbird's life. And also, Joe Cosley was amazingly soft-spoken, and people had to really, really be quiet and struggle to hear him. So if you can imagine this 6-foot-tall plus mountain man just eloquently speaking, he's an incredibly polite person, bowing his head at women when they walk by, not for any reason other than his pure polite and his character, and him telling this story. So I always thought it was very telling, and he was not just a person who was well read, he was also a very astute writer and a observationalist and kind of a philosopher himself. Here is an example, a good friend of him who was very, very influential, John Kootenai Brown up in Waterton. If you read this postcard, all of his scrawl here, it says, compliments of 2 expert guides of the Rockies, who are Cosley and one of his friends. Watch their smoke curl down upon you in friendship embrace. I think what he would mean is friendly embrace. Watch their smoke curl down upon you in friendly embrace. It either means the Rockies or the smoke from them. And that is actually a native saying or a native aesthetic that he and John Kootenai Brown's wife, who was full native, and they would speak in their native tongues together when they would see each other. And that would be a way that they would speak to one another just out of polite respect for coming and going and seeing someone that you care about. And so he translated that kind of spirituality into English and would say those types of things to other people. And it really moved people, and it made people really love him beyond just an educated person. He was also a person they really loved because of who he was. And that was from up in, the Rockies, Northern Rockies, down past Southern Glacier. And on the back of this postcard, he also wrote, "See America First," because that is kind of, he was just joking about the theory of the time, or the saying that James J. Hill said. So here's another postcard. These postcards, he would know when they were coming, and he would stage this with all of his friends, and so you would send these postcards out to your family for like Christmas. This was like a thing that everybody did in the area. So on the back of this postcard, it wrote, "Here's where friendship ceases and business commences." That's Joe in the middle, and he and his friends are basically taking the money from these guys. These horses on the left are Joe's pack horses, and it is Jingo and Black Bessie. Jingo is the one on the left, and that is his pack horse. You can see the double diamond hitch, which this text refers to below. And these 2 horses were lost when he went over one of his many trips over Ahern Bass. He lost both of these horses, which he was really, really attached to. And he almost lost his life also when a giant piece of snow gave way and they fell 1,000+ feet to the death of horses. He had to live basically impoverished in squalor for the next several months until the snow melted enough to where he could crawl down in there and get all of his supplies that were his horses, that were attached to his horses, basically. So it was significant, and these are the type of cards he used, these postcards he's sending. So this one was "Better born lucky than rich." and that is Joe on the left. So you can see he was a character. Not everybody would do these types of things. People would just typically pose like this, like Kootenai Brown here, and send those to family and friends. Because you were a tough guy out west, this is what a tough guy looked like. But not Joe, he would send these little postcards. He's like the first Instagrammer. He would have been a great tweeter, I think, you know. And so here is John Kootenai Brown, a friend of him. And I threw him in because Cosley claims that John's style of dressing with these sashes and this colorful flair that he had gotten from Cosley, but it's generally accepted that Cosley knew him as a young man and John was already dressing like this. And so Cosley imitated that. And he was impeccably dressed at all time, very, very sharp, very, very clean. And so he had even fancy, you know, polished pistols with ivory grips with his name, you know, engraved on them. He had a fancy alligator saddle. These were things far above his means, and he just did it to kind of accentuate his Wild West, you know, persona of him being the wild mountain man and highly successful. And I think he really sought the fame and the success that Kootenai Brown had, and which eluded him his whole life. And so he lived from the 90s into the early 1900s in the Belly River area in Waterton, trapping with the local communities, being loved, writing on trees, carving, fording the rivers there, and gaining extreme notoriety. This is the cabin in the Belly River that he built and lived in when the park became a park around him. And things get really exciting here shortly. So he builds this old cabin and is living out in what becomes the park. He hears news of this park. And so the park basically asks him to become, which they ask all the local trappers and hunters to become the first rangers, which seems almost like a good idea, but seems like a really bad idea because they're breaking all the laws that they're supposed to be preventing. And they told them you can hunt for subsistence, but no more trapping, lead people around. He's certainly doing things like this before and possibly after, but he is mainly just wants to be left alone and just traps and just hunts. And he hides from other rangers. You're supposed to keep the cabin nice and clean and neat and have food for other rangers because they do huge circles around the park. And when rangers would come to visit Joe, the cabin would be locked. It would be when they would break into it, there would be no food. His stuff was literally completely covering every square inch of the floor. Nothing was put up. It was incredibly dirty. It smelled horrible. And they never saw Joe typically until they were to leave or snowshoe out. And then they would find Joe's tracks where he had followed them and watched them and never made his presence known. Of course, that does freak some people out in that area. And Joe did have friends, but he also had people who were not that friendly to him. And after several years of him being, keep in mind, this is when the park was still debating on what uniforms they were going to be using. And, you know, of course, he did have uniform and he was a ranger for a few years. And after being fired and rehired several times because they all knew he was trapping, they would get the receipts, and people up in Carson, up in Canada, would tell how many amazing furs, how many thousands of dollars he had sold of furs that past year. And everyone knew he had only been in the Belly River and Waterton area that entire year. They knew that he was poaching. And so finally, around the start of World War I, he was finally told he would never receive another paycheck and he would be arrested if he was caught in the park again. And he disappeared for a few years. And when he came back, he had a giant pocket full of medals. And what had happened is he had enlisted in Canada and went over and fought in World War I and got a whole load of medals being a scout sniper sharpshooter. Supposedly, there are reports over 500 successful shots and a record in the entire British Army for successful shots during that time. But as with everything with Joe, you never know what is true. Certainly he came back and it was a really graphic and long and terrible war for him. And he was very successful because he was widely decorated. And so when he comes back, he is even more of a larger than life figure. You can see from this article, Cosley, whose country is the world, achieves fame wherever he goes. And you can see Joe Cosley in his hut in the wilderness, which he had multiple huts around. And this is a story outlining a little bit of his shenanigans. And there are multiple stories of and around of him going out before the war and after the war, him coming back a decorated hero, and he basically returns to the wilderness that he knew and loved. And a lot of the people that he had grown up with, so to speak, from those 1880s and 1890s and early 1900s and beyond, they were now the community leaders, and they were now running things, running cattle operations, running Waterton, running Glacier, having huge businesses around, and some rangers. And so Joe is allowed to kind of, since he's now a known sharpshooter, a known, war hero, a known already trapper, hunter, and very skilled, person out on the trail to track, he is given a large leeway. And when he is encountered, people, I think, look the other way. And Joe is so good. He knows where to go and where he can go to not be caught for trapping. And he does this delicate dance with the park within Waterton and within Glacier, and everyone knows he's doing it for years, basically for 1919 until the late 1920s, even into 1929, for a decade. And then in the summer, he is guiding trips. And I know exactly how beautiful it is. You can see me there with the worst selfie face ever. And in the mini glacier area, anywhere up into the Waterton, the Prince of Wales Hotel where we stay, he definitely was up and around in this area, in crossing the Belly River at a lot of the fords, in Don Mist Falls, Ptarmigan Tunnel, which was not there yet, but this is just some of the scenery where he was. And so I know that he was having an amazing life, guiding, leading trips, packing, telling stories in this area, because I have had the pleasure of doing the same thing there myself. I met my fiance on a trip to Lake Elizabeth, where he supposedly proposed to his wife. I did not propose to my fiance there, but he did. And so I am familiar with his stomping grounds, is my message there. And he has a peaceful existence for the first time in his life, hanging out in this place that he loves so much, until 1923 is really when it starts. Enter another Joe. Look at this character. That's right. His name is Joe Hymes. And Joe Hymes, a total character, born in 1901, significantly younger than Joe Cosley. He comes to Glacier in 1923 after he lived in California for a few years as a clerk at a hospital somewhere. And then one day he hears about the big Dempsey Gibbons fight, I think in 1923 in Shelby, Montana. And he quits his job because he's a big fan of boxing. He loves boxing himself. He jumps on a freight train, literally legally, and goes like a hobo up to Shelby, Montana, lives there for a few weeks, training before the fight, just to watch the fight. He does not spar any of the fighters, although he did spar famous boxers later in life. And so he watches the fight, and he's so emboldened by the Montana adventure feeling, he jumps on another freight train illegally and goes towards the end of the line, which is up in Glacier National Park. And Joe Hymes jumps off of the train there and volunteers to become a seasonal ranger, which he does for several years. And in the early 20s, in his early 20s, he is stationed the first place in Cosley's old cabin, Joe Cosley's old cabin that he built in the Belly River. That is literally where he is stationed. And so he says it's miserable, it's the lowest man. Oh, Sorry, I apologize. It's my vicious attack dog. And so he is stationed in this cabin. He hears everyone around him talk about, you're in Cosley's cabin, Joe's cabin. If you see Joe, do not approach him. He is an illegal poacher and trapper and a war hero, a sharpshooter. He will kill you where you stand. He will kill you with his bare hands. Do not approach. Do not mess with this man. But also you're supposed to arrest him if you see him poaching. And so these are his orders. And so Joe lives there for a few years, is transferred out as a part-time person. And then in the mid 1920s, he becomes a full-time ranger when someone actually dies and he's able to get a job. Not kidding. And so he works in a couple different places in the park. And in 1926, either he requests it or people want him to go back, he is assigned to move back to the Belly River into Joe Cosley's cabin. He's already established a garden there. He has a beautiful life. He loves it. You should read Hymes' writings of the area. It's in that Brian McClung book. It's very, very interesting, just his daily life and what he does. He is a total character himself. And so, he has born and raised in his glacier life, so to speak. He lived in Cosley's house first. He has heard the larger than life tales of Cosley throughout his entire career there. How he's a wild man, how he can out-hike anyone, how he's a ladies' man, how he is a fancy shooter, a fancy writer, a poet, you know, all of these accolades. And now he's just a criminal who's poaching in his valley, the Belly River, which is now Hymes's valley, although it used to be called Joe's place, which was Joe Cosley, not Joe Hymes. And so supposedly Hymes writes, he does nothing out of the ordinary. He just does his job and does his normal circles, you know, patrolling the area. But friends who knew him and people around the community and Cosley himself said, because Cosley is watching him, because he has trails along all of the trails in the park, and he watches whoever comes in the park, especially the rangers, because he learns their movements, and then he's able to trap and hunt illegally around them, literally. And so Hymes, when he first came in this 1926 era, he told everyone in Apgar, he told everyone in West Glacier, I'm going to the Belly River, I'm transferring there, and oh yeah, I'm going to be the guy to arrest Joe Cosley. And these are people who've known Joe Cosley for 30, 35 years at this point. They're like, son, do not even approach that man. He will kill you, as I've said. He's a wild man. He will come and kill you in the sleep. If you attack him, just do it with his bare hands. Like, give him a wide berth. Like, he is very dangerous. And so Hymes, being the young man he is, keep in mind, he's 27 years old when he is saying all this and going up to do this. And so he is a young man with something to prove. And so I even wonder if some of those people who were friends with Joe Cosley and knew that he was there trapping kind of sent Hymes up there because they knew Hymes was tough. And although Joe was that last page in that last chapter of humanity in America and North America that I spoke about, Hymes was kind of the person on that first new page of the new chapter of humanity. And he's a tough guy in and of himself, a boxer and not to take any guff from anybody, speak his mind type character. And so I wonder if it was a punishment to Hymes or if it was some brilliant people, some brilliant politicians who knew, like, you know, maybe we send Hymes up there, maybe he'll scare Cosley, you know, enough to keep him to stay up in Canada. So whatever it is, Hymes finds himself in the late 1920s in the haunts of Joe Cosley, around Cosley Bridge, around Cosley Lake, in Cosley's cabin, near Elizabeth Lake, Helen Lake, Sioux Lake, all of these lakes, all these things that Cosley named, literally, in the place where his livelihood depends on trapping illegally. And he's looking supposedly every day of the year for Cosley. And after 3 years of looking from 1926 to 1929, one May afternoon, Joe Hymes is out, and one of his jobs is he has to constantly go, especially in the spring, and dynamite these beaver lodges. And so there was actually roads all through Glacier. You'll see some photos here momentarily of that in these extreme remote areas that were used for supplies and all sorts of different things. Even it was still there from when it was not a park. And so one of the roads that they were still using at this time, they had to dynamite a specific beaver den or lodge, and it would, because it would flood out that portion of the road. And so Hymes supposedly went down there just on his normal track, and he found a single print of a single large boot in the fresh snow on top of that beaver den. And so on top of that big lodge. And so he thinks, this might be Cosley. It was coming from Canada, going south. This is exactly in the trap line. He would be working these beavers, he thought. And so he follows the tracks as best he can, and he loses them in the willows. And so the next day, he gathers some supplies, his dog, his horse, and he goes out to where he lost them. And just luck of the draw, just a few miles south of the Canadian border, he finds a small trapper's camp, illegally trapping in the park. And we know that that's what it is because there is a tarp and there is a fleshing beam, which is down into Joe's left hand there. And there is a nice bed made out of pine boughs with stakes on the ground on each side to hold them all up, and it's quite comfortable, he said. He actually finds correspondence signed by Cosley. He finds bills of sale with Cosley's name on it. He collects some of it. He thinks, I've got him. He takes his rifle, his pistol, his dog, goes up and he hides at a higher place and sits there all day and all afternoon. He says, I'm prepared to wait all night. And after he sits there all day, he thinks, you know, I should really go get some warmer clothes if I'm going to be here all night and some more supplies. So he and the dog run back to his cabin, and he makes a phone call to rangers at Waterton, who are, you know, only hours hike from where they are. And so, especially on horseback, they could be there pretty quickly. So he tells the person exactly where they are. They know this area very well. They think they can find it. And he says, I think I found Cosley's camp. I need reinforcements to help me bring this guy in. And so he comes back that evening with supplies and his dog, and he hunkers down to wait all night. He waits another few hours, and it's just starting to get dark, and he thinks, well, once it gets dark, I'm not going to be able to see anything, and this is going to be dangerous, so I'm going to probably leave here in a little while. And he is afraid that Cosley has actually seen him coming in. And so he thinks, well, I've lost him. He has evaded justice once again. And just at that moment, the dog's ears go back, and the dog points, just like he does whenever he sees a bear or an animal that Himes can't see himself. And he looks in the direction that the dog is pointing, and a few moments later, a tall, slender figure with long legs, carrying snowshoes actually, and a single small .22 rifle, walks up and makes his way into camp. It was Joe Cosley. Himes is sitting there shaking with excitement. Cosley comes into the camp not knowing, because Himes had disguised himself being there, and not knowing that anyone has been in camp. Himes waits for him to put down the .22 rifle and to start to gather kindling around his campsite to make a fire. He's already carrying pelts right then, and Himes steps up from the shrubs. As soon as there's any movement, Cosley immediately reaches for his rifle, and Himes says, Cosley, if you touch that gun, I'll shoot you through the guts. That's his exact words. And so Cosley says, like, what's going on? Oh, are you that new ranger? And he says, yes, I am. Are you Joe Cosley? He's like, no, I'm John Smith, just passing through. And he's like, stop it. You're lying right now. I know you're Cosley. I've been through your camp. I found your correspondence. I found your letters. And Cosley tries to deny it for a few more minutes, like, oh, I just found this place. And he's like, give it up, Cosley. I'm the guy that lives in your cabin. And Cosley's like, okay, all right. Yeah, I know who you are. I've been following you around for years. Literally, I know exactly who you are. You're actually kind of slow and you sleep in too late, is what he told him. He starts to make fun of him. They go back and forth for hours. Himes immediately ties him up, and Cosley is resolute the whole time. Sir, you are not going to arrest me. I am going into Canada here shortly, and you can stay here in America, and I won't come back. He tries everything. He tries to plead with Himes. He tries to buy him off. He says he's got thousands of dollars in furs stashed in the Belly River, which is true, because it's this time of year where trappers will stash the furs and then take them out. And he says, you know, you can retire a ranger, buy a small farm, or live like the most well-paid ranger in the history of the world. They fight. They are yelling at one another, calling each other the worst names. They have long, meaningful, deep conversations. Everything, anything Cosley can do to try to get him to let him go. And Himes is like, you are my meal ticket in the National Park Service. You are not going anywhere. And at a certain point, Cosley realizes this, tries to get some sleep, most likely just trying to get Himes to fall asleep so that he can escape. And Himes, speaks actually very highly of Cosley during this time, and says that he was very eloquent, very well spoken. He mentions that soft spokenness, that you had to kind of lean in and listen, and he couldn't hear what he said most of the time, and he kept telling him to repeat himself. And so finally they resolve themselves to staying there all night, and in the morning at first light they get up trying to warm themselves with the fire, and Himes starts to lead his prisoner out of the forest, just a very small distance away from the Belly River, and cross it and get out onto the road, hike back to his cabin. They get not too far away from the camp, and there are a series of brutal fist fights that break out between the two men. Anytime Joe Cosley's hands are tied, they're in extreme tight forest to where Cosley can't do any real damage to Himes. And keep in mind, Himes is 27 years old. Joe Cosley is 58 years old, a war veteran, a tough mountain man. Well, he does not know he is dealing with kind of a tough young guy himself who is a very skilled boxer. And so Himes actually hurts Joe Cosley. And in these several attempts that Cosley tries to make and tries to punch Himes and run away, a normal man would have probably been knocked unconscious for a few minutes, and Cosley would have given him the slip. But Himes was such a tough guy, he actually stood toe to toe with him and gave him a beat down. And Cosley and Himes both admit the only thing that he could do to actually keep him down was he kept jumping on him and sitting on him. And so he eventually Himes really hurt him, and like holding his head against a tree and punching him, things like that. And he said, finally, okay, you've hurt me, I'm sick, I can't even really move anymore. He probably had some internal injuries. And he said, I am yours, whatever you want to do. So he peacefully walks out of the forest. Shortly down the road, they see two people approaching. Himes is concerned that it's one of his partners who he had caught before in the backcountry trapping with Cosley, just a partner, not Cosley. And he gets himself with his rifle out in between the two people, and he looks up, and it's the Rangers from Waterton who escort Cosley and Joe Himes to the ranger station here, where they call headquarters, and they say they have just captured the wild animal Joe Cosley. So they have to hike up and over Gable Pass, which is in the background here. They have to get into a car. They have to take that car down to East Glacier, get onto a train, take the train over to West Glacier, walk over to Apgar, and that is where the constable was, and they were able to house and actually book the prisoner. And so, what do you think a 27-year-old Joe Himes does after he does something like that? You guessed it. He goes around to that entire town and boasts to everyone who will listen, including the old timers who told him not to mess with Cosley. He says, yep, I arrested the wild animal. He's in jail now. No one believed him. They were all riveted by the story. But as he left each place, they started to formulate a plan. And I think you can imagine where this is going to go. And so basically, Himes has a couple days there. Cosley's there a couple days before he's fully booked and able to post bail. Two people in town each put up $50. It's $100 bail, and Cosley actually concocts this plan with them. They were able to actually meet with Cosley in back room for like an hour plus, multiple times, to plan this escape. And so basically the first moment that Cosley could be posted bail, within hours, he was out. He had gone to a store who his friend owned, and the guy had given him snowshoes, had given him all the gear that he wanted, which was all pre-set up. And Cosley said, once I get my furs and get to Canada, I will send you the money, which he did supposedly. And then he went with a friend to another friend's house where they had made a massive, massive meal for him. And then that friend got in an automobile with him and drove him to the Logan River, or the Logan Creek, which is ranger station, which is the farthest that the going to the Stun road goes. We see this on our trip. Sometimes I point it out, and it was the farthest that road went at that point. At that point, it was a trailhead. Cosley eats this massive meal on the way because he knows as soon as Himes figures out that he has escaped, he knows that he is going to go over and be waiting for him in that Belly River section. And so Cosley eats the food on the car ride, is last seen running down the trail with snacks and food and all the gear that he needs towards Ahern Pass, which is the fastest route from that area up and over through Packers Roost, up and over Ahern Pass, down Helen, through Elizabeth, into the Belly River to collect whatever, if he can beat him. About this time, someone comes into a room where supposedly Joe Himes is literally regaling a small group of rangers in a kitchen about the big capture of Joe Cosley. And someone walks up smilingly, says, Himes, did you hear that Cosley just posted bail? Himes looks horrified, runs out of the room, but he knows he's already too late because the last train going from West Glacier that day had already left. And he had to wait a full day to catch the next train. So he got all of his stuff ready, met that next train at West Glacier, went over to East Glacier, jumped on a car, drove as fast as he could up, jumped on horses, went up and over Gable Pass, down into the Belly River, straight to Joe Cosley's camp. And what did he find? Joe Cosley had hiked up and over Ahern Pass into the Belly River, collected all of those furs, gotten all of his gear that was left at that camp, and hightailed it across the Canadian border. That's right. He had lost the wild animal. And so where he went was from Apgar down at the bottom of this, straight up through the park on foot, and had beaten the train, the car, the horse, and Himes. And he disappeared north into northern Alberta, which is where he always wanted to go, and found a small trapper's cabin there and lived for another 15 years peacefully, becoming a loved member of that community, trapping and doing what he loved best, which was being out in the wilderness. And when he was 73, in the fall, as he was leaving, supposedly, the store where he would get his last winter's rations before going out and not seeing anybody till late spring, he didn't even turn around in the doorway of the store. He said to the shop owner, "If I don't come back by this date, have such and such and these people go up to my cabin, you know where it is, and collect my things and do this with my body." And that was the last person to see him alive. He died of scurvy in his bed that winter in a cabin that he himself said was cursed because the previous trapper who lived there died of scurvy also. And so the only person who was able to take down and catch the wild animal was the wild animal himself by going up there and living in that cabin by himself. So that is the end of the story, my friends. Thank you very much for joining us. Remember, check out alifeonvacation.com, grizzly bear approved. And thank you for joining us with Tales from the Dusty Trail, Volume 3. And my closing comments to you, even though we're stuck, maybe you're stuck like I am with a lot of snow outside, which I don't mind, of course. Still, try to get out there. Seek out wilderness near your home and further afield. Watch out for dehydration, sunburn, poison oak, scorpions, snakes, bears. Learn how to be safe. Take more photos than you think you need. Have fun out there and travel safe and sustainably. And I'm here to answer questions as long as you all need.
Great. Thank you, Jeremy. That was an incredible story. I was riveted the whole time. Thank you.
Thank you.
We do have some good questions for you. I just want to remind everyone who's watching, if you have a question for Jeremy, you can submit those in your control panel under the questions field. I think people are really they just enjoyed the story. There's not a ton of questions, so I do encourage people, if you do have a question, to submit those. First of all,
oh, one quick thing. I typically will say this throughout it, but I got carried away with a few of the little intricacies of it. The park, Doug Follick, the longest working ranger, and Joe Himes, in his career, he was the longest working ranger in Glacier National Park. He worked there until the 60s. And he was a total character. You really should look him up. But the longest working ranger in National Park Service history was also at Glacier National Park. It's Doug Follick, and he was a teacher in Whitefish, nearby town. And I've asked him in an interview, Doug, what do you think? How did the park change? And he said, well, Jeremy, it hasn't really changed in my lifetime. I mean, different cars, more people, definitely, but largely the park looks exactly the same. And he knows, because he gives lectures on it, that it has changed, but those changes have been subtle over time. Receding glaciers, alpine meadows being encroached by subalpine fir and other trees. And so it has changed, but it's not something perceptible to even him. And so this place is still very wild, and it still very much has that spirit of, the wilderness, and a place where some man like Joe Cosley could call home. And I urge you to see it here first before you go off to Switzerland or any far-flung part of the world, or even northern Canada or Alaska to see mountains. See them in the Rockies first too.
All right. So a couple requests here. Could you first put up the slide with the books on them again? People really want to be able to get down the authors' names.
Yes. Let's see. This will be the quickest way. So, Good Medicine Collection by Adolf Hungry Wolf, and The People Before the Park. Those are the ones for some Native history. I'll come back to those in a second. And then the Belly Rivers Famous Joe Cosley by Brian McClung. And it's a very well researched book. It's written pretty good, we'll say. And the stories in it are this is the best compilation of those stories, and the best group of those photos also, definitely.
All right. And in a moment, I'm going to ask you to put up your website again. I will move on to the next question. There's a few people who want to know if it's known if Cosley fathered any children.
That is an excellent question. I have never encountered it. And he is known as the ladies' man, but it's a lot of heartbreak, both him breaking hearts and his heart being broken. And there are some of those stories, we just didn't have time today, that are very famous and elaborate. But I've never come across any even hint or claims that someone was related to him.
All right.
Good question, though.
Yeah. Is it possible to visit the cabin still? Is it still there?
It's very possible. It's there. The park uses it to store tax supplies for their horses. It's not even like a historic building. I think it is actually designated something, but you can walk right up to it. Now the rangers might be like, what are you doing here? Because it's their backcountry house, but you're like, this is my land. I'm just looking at it. Say that to them too, they'll love it. And say you're there to look at the Cosley cabin. They will have no problem with that. But it is literally still there. There have been other structures built, but his cabin is still there. And a lot of the sites, if you really look them up on the maps, you can find some of his exact sites. And there are still, I think, 2 trees that they're called Cosley trees, and they're mapped out. You can find them online. You can find them if you go to Waterton, especially. I think is the easiest one to find. And so you still can find evidence of him beyond him just naming a significant portion of the northeast of the section of the park. And you can see his pistols, his saddle, and some of his drawings, some of his other paraphernalia at different places and different, museums and kind of events around the Whitefish, Columbia Falls area, in Kalispell area. And so at different times, they'll have it at different places. So when you visit there, it's worth looking up, because I think right now the pistols are in a bank or something. I don't know. It's like on display. And so you can see a lot of that stuff still.
That's pretty cool. Okay, would you mind putting up your website again, the slide with your website?
alifeonvacation.com is the website, and there's a tremendous amount of stuff up there. I have 4 podcasts, which you can listen to just straight on the website there, or if you have a iPhone, I think you can do this also on Android, but you just go to the podcast thing right there, and then you would type in a life. Oh, there it is right there. You type in a life on vacation. If you have not listened to episode 3, oh, there it is right there. And then also it will be on Spotify soon, but it's going to be probably another 3-4 weeks before I get another couple episodes up. It's still in the soft opening stage, but it is still very much there and going. And hopefully I will have a little e-store on the website here in the next quarter or so. And so we'll see, cross fingers. But do check it out. There's a ton of interesting stuff, not just about Glacier, but expanding the entire North American continent, and more being added regularly.
Cool. So where did Cosley buy his supplies and sell his furs?
Excellent question. And this is highly detailed in the book, and it was all over. He would be coming up to Waterton and Cardston and Edmonton in southern Canada, but he would also certainly be getting things from Apgar and Glacier, West Glacier, Kalispell, Columbia Falls at that time. I mean, Columbia Falls was one of the places, all of those places, if they had a newspaper, they would announce that Joe Cosley was coming. And so he would be coming in from a big trip or from a big pack job, and then he would be resupplying in all of those places. And he was one of those types of people who would only come in town once or twice a year to get sugar, get bullets, get thread and needles. He would, if he would just sold all of his furs, which he did up north also, Cardston, Edmonton, and beyond, and then he would blow a lot of his money in days, literally, on all that fancy stuff to kind of further that persona that he was putting out there for everybody. But also at a certain point, he knew so many wealthy people, he would actually direct sell to individuals because they could get the furs cheaper from him than they would get from a house, and he would get more of the share of the money than he would if he was selling directly to a fur company, if that makes sense. And so he was selling every way you could, direct and to companies, and he was generally not the most honest person to go into business with. Now, his business partners made money. Joe Cosley just made far more money than them, but he was also doing far more running and covering a lot more mileage than them. So it wasn't like he was ripping them off.
All right. And last question, someone wants to know if there was ever a movie or a documentary made about his life.
Not that I can find, but I have to think that there have been characters in movies that were modeled after him and some of these characters, but I don't know of it. And this would be a great movie. It really would be. And, you know, I could see it even being, you know, fun for all ages, as there's not a lot of extremeness, you know, there's not like a lot of shooting in this, kind of a fisticuffs John Wayne type movie, not like a ultraviolet type movie, you know, that, because in that era there was a lot of ultraviolence, you know, but this was kind of a more wholesome life that Joe Cosley lived. So I don't know of one. You should make it. I would
You
happily,
should make it.
I would love to be part of that project.
Yeah, it really is an amazing story. It would make a fantastic movie. Okay, I'm going to call it there with questions. Thank you so much, Jeremy. Such an amazing story, a great way to end the week. So thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. I'm going to hand it back to you for any further closing comments.
I don't have anything. Thank you all for your time, and you're welcome. It's been my absolute pleasure dusting off some of these memories for myself. I talk about this on every one of my trips, so it's been really fun. I haven't been able to talk about this in a couple of years with people. So thank you very much for the opportunity. And you guys have fun out there. Go out for a walk after this talk right now.
Thanks again, Jeremy. And my
Thank you.
thanks as well to everyone who tuned in. Be sure to join us on Monday for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can see next week's lineup on our website and keep an eye out for our Sunday e-news. We did record today's presentation and we'll have the replay available on our website soon. And with that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. Have a great weekend.